You who are on time, and the commissioner was on time as well, so we don't want to delay him either. I'm Andrew Seeley, I'm director of the Mexico Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center. You are at an event that is organized, however, not only by the Woodrow Wilson Center today, but we're very honored to be working with the Conference of State Legislators, the Border Legislative Conference, and the Council of State Governments West, two of our key partners with whom we've been working for a long time on border infrastructure and border management issues, looking more broadly at how we can best manage our shared border in a coherent and cohesive way, something that I know is very close to Commissioner Burson's heart as well. We are also fortunate to have people from the North American Center for Transborder Studies at Arizona State University and El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, the Northern Border College in Tijuana and throughout northern Mexico here today, who are key partners with us in the Border Research Partnership, an effort to try and shed light on key research issues in the border. And if I can do a quick commercial before we start, for those of you who are either from the border or have friends in the border or colleagues that you work with, one of the exciting things that we've been doing together is working on a prize for cross-border cooperation, trying to identify key experiences that are being done by organizations in the border region, in the 10 border states, Mexico, U.S. side, where people are working on both sides of the border together in creative, innovative, new ways that may not be known about. We both are going to do an award later this year and also write these up in a way that they are known beyond their immediate region. We think there's some great stories at the border to be talked about that should be known by a wider audience. We are very fortunate today to start off this discussion, to have the person who really has been I would say, the point person in this administration, in the Obama administration, working on the 21st Century Border Initiative, working on a wide range of border issues. People could say that there are many people working on the border, but I don't think there's anyone who has been nearly as outspoken, who has been nearly as clear, and who has really driven the process of thinking within the Obama administration and perhaps within our country as much as Alan Burson. And so we're very pleased that he's agreed to speak here. You have his bio. He is the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection. He's a former U.S. Attorney responsible for border issues out of San Diego. He's been Secretary of Education in California. He's held a number of other positions in charge of San Diego County Public Schools. You have his whole information here. But for our purposes today, I mean, he really has been giving dynamic leadership. And we must say, before he took this position, he had started to chair a commission that was done by Pacific Council and COMEXI, looking at border issues, how to manage this better. During this process, he moved into the current position and left that, but he has always had this close to his heart, and so we want to turn it over to him to give our keynote speech today. Alan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew.
If you want to take it up there, that'd be great. And this meeting's on the record.
So, thank you, Andrew. This is a terrific opportunity for the Border Legislative Conference and the Council of State Governments in the setting of the Woodrow Wilson Center to assess where we are and where we're going in terms of regional planning and border infrastructure. El futuro ya no es lo que era antes. The future is not what it used to be. And that is not what could be said about infrastructure, which is, I intend to make it not exhilarating. That would be a bridge too far. But as critical as it is to the future of North America, as key as it is to North American economic competitiveness and the relationship between Mexico and the United States, and by extension Canada and the United States, these two remarkably long and relatively peaceful borders that exist on our northern and southern borders, speaking from the vantage point of the United States. But the fact is, for so long, the issue of border infrastructure attracted very little attention because nothing really ever changed. It was difficult to get presidential permit in the United States. It was difficult to find financing in either country, and it was very difficult indeed to find common planning. So that, in fact, on the northern border, we have something on the order of 175 ports, and in the southern border we have 40 ports. Actually 130 in the north and 40, 3 times as many ports in the north as on the southern border. About $1 billion a day coming back and forth between Mexico and the United States, and a little bit more than that moving between Canada and the United States daily. $2 billion a day crossing our northern and southern borders, and we have an infrastructure that is woefully unsuited. So although we have 3 times as many ports on the northern border as on the southern border, in fact, the 70 ports on the north account for only 4% of the trade. It is all concentrated among 20 large ports, and in the southern context, it's about 15 large ports that carry most of the burden, and the concentration in places like Laredo, San Diego, El Paso, Brownsville, Matamoros, Tamaulipas is the shows that we have real concentration. And when you look at the infrastructure, you realize that we do not have the infrastructure that we need to support that kind of trade. And the reason, frankly, is historical, as in most cases. For most of United States-Mexico border history, el tercer país, in fact, neither Mexico, capital of in the district of the capital of in Mexico, or Washington paid much attention to local interests. The events that were occurring on the border were far away from both capitals, and both capitals, when they managed to talk together, did not talk about border infrastructure. And the result is what we have, a physical set of ports of entry that are inadequate to the need and antiquated in and of themselves. Most of the ports of entry have been built in 40 to 70 years ago, and simply are not equipped to meet the needs of contemporary trade, even in its own terms, let alone on the scale necessary to support North American competitiveness in terms of dealing with the East Asia or the Indian subcontinent over the next 50 years. But there is good news. There is good news, and that's why the future is not what it used to be. What I'd like to do is talk about some fairly dramatic developments in one area, to be sure, which is the planning area, and to start to move into an area in which we're beginning to see, thanks to my friend and colleague Jerónimo Gutierrez, some interesting dimensions on the funding end of it, and because of particular creativity at our Department of State and at SRE, some public-private partnerships that were unthinkable in the context of border infrastructure even 5 years ago. And then at the end of the talk, before, with Andrew's leave, taking some questions from you, hard and high ones, I'd like to talk to you about a vision that transcends physical infrastructure in terms of where I believe borders and border infrastructure is going and how it needs to be seen. So what is the remarkable change in terms of planning? Thanks to President Calderon and President Obama, who meet again tomorrow, when they met in May, for the first time in the history of our two countries, they exchanged a list of bilateral border infrastructure priorities. As remarkable, again, as it seems, we had never, ever sat with our Mexican colleagues, nor they with us, and exchanged a list of priorities in terms of border infrastructure. To President Calderon and President Obama's everlasting credit, in the last year, 3 major ports of entry have been opened up at Ángel Duas, Dona, and in San Luis, 3 major ports of entry after having gone a decade during which trade between the United States and Mexico tripled without building a single port of entry. But the planning breakthrough came when President Obama and President Calderon on May 19th called for the building of a 21st century border, issued a declaration that in part called on their countries and the leadership in their countries, quote, to develop the border and management in a holistic fashion and in ways that facilitate the secure, efficient, and rapid flow of goods and people and reduce the cost of doing business between our two countries. End of quote. This was the opportunity to then move forward, and unlike so many times when summits result in working groups that do not move the policy agenda forward, the president's called for the creation of an executive steering committee that would actually govern the dimensions of the bilateral agenda, and in particular the 21st century border. And that committee met in Mexico City in December, and for the first time, again, unprecedented between our two countries, there was plans laid for the creation of a binational infrastructure planning council. Now, I should say, in praise of the State Department and DHS, Transportation, Commerce, and GSA, when I first began watching the border and becoming involved in border infrastructure matters in the early 1990s, there was no place in the United States government where you could go and deconflict the different perspectives of all of these agencies, each of which had a particular interest in border infrastructure: Commerce, GSA, CBP, then it was Customs and Immigration, Transportation. Every agency, with state paving the political way with presidential permits, had a say in whether or not infrastructure would be built at this particular point in the border. And frankly, there was very little cooperation. I should say parenthetically, I just finished a conversation with Bob Peck, who is the commissioner, the number 2 at GSA in charge of border infrastructure. Bob and I were at law school more than a generation ago, and he had been the first time I was in government as the U.S. attorney in Southern California and as the so-called border czar in the Clinton administration. He was the number 2 at GSA in charge of border infrastructure, and he's come back and taken the same job and is working mightily to build relationships among the agencies. But he said that traditionally it was GSA's attitude that we're not happy until you aren't. And I said, well, that was the CBP view, but it has generally changed now, and we are working very well together. For the first time, under the leadership of the National Security Staff, there is, on the U.S. side, a National Security Staff integrated interagency policy coordination committee, at which all of the representatives of these different agencies sit together and actually work through the issues of border infrastructure. It's an amazing institutional accomplishment, and permitted the U.S. side to be ready to hand over, first in May, through President Obama to President Calderon, the list of projects that were agreed upon by all of the agencies in the U.S. government having an interest therein. And then in December, being able to represent that we had our interagency organized and provided the impetus to the Mexican government to develop a similar interagency development, to develop a similar mechanism on the Mexican side that now permits there to be relatively straightforward discussions about where are we going to build, modernize, and in some cases close ports of entry that need to be closed. It's a remarkable breakthrough. As simple as it may sound, simply connecting the pipes and channeling the communications is a massive breakthrough with terrific implications. And that is what we say on the border, un buen trato. It's a big deal. It's an important deal. When you couple that development with the second dramatic change that's taken place, which is the regional planning master plans that are being worked on through the along the U.S.-Mexican border. The Baja California plan has already been completed, I believe. There's work on a Chihuahua West Texas plan in the Juarez El Paso corridor. The Rio Grande Valley, Tamaulipas, Coahuila, are working toward developing these regional plans in which local communities will be in a position to articulate a vision about their own community cross-border, and then be in a position to work with the respective federal governments, and then the federal governments working together to actually design a schedule for the building of infrastructure. So those kinds of institutional developments hold out promise and, frankly, make efficient what was an impossible process. This was a process that could be stopped by very minimal political opposition. It was a process that constantly defaulted to the lowest common denominator, which always seemed to be do nothing, and I think accounts for a lot of how we ended up where we are today. So, extraordinary developments on the planning side, and I think one dimension of that is the fact that we're very proud of our colleagues at State who managed to deliver a presidential permit in the shortest, in the record time on history. And later on this afternoon, when Stuart Tuttle is on the panel, he will tell you whether it was 6 months or 9 months or 13 months. But it was in that area, which was unheard of. Presidential permits would limp along in the American bureaucracy a decade at a clip, so that cutting that by 90%, I think, indicates the kind of momentum that we have moving forward. Then you get, as my friends would say, it's not the money, it's the principle, it's the money. You run into the second largest obstacle here, which is how do we fund these projects? Even with the ARA funding, the stimulus funding of 2 years ago, in which the Obama administration invested $700 million in the modernization of ports of entry on the northern and southern borders. Even with the investment of in a $600 million project that was initiated at San Isidro in my hometown of San Diego, Tijuana, last week. Even with the opening of the 3 bridges in the last year, we still reckon that we are somewhere, depending on the estimates, somewhere between, I've seen estimates of $4 billion behind in infrastructure and $10 billion. And the number that we've adopted at CBP is that we're $6 billion behind in infrastructure. But the picture indicates that we are always playing catch-up. And the interesting phenomenon is that you really can't ever catch up because of the political process that would depend upon appropriations from Mexico and from Washington, in which we ask taxpayers in Michoacan and Iowa to fund development in Chihuahua or Sonora or California, Texas, New Mexico. It's a very difficult political reach, and even though there is lots of lip service paid to how important the border is, the politics of appropriation, particularly in a time of budget crunch, makes it exceedingly difficult to generate the resources you need to have a regular funding program that then triggers the processes of planning, infrastructure, implementation, and execution that is commonplace in the private sector. Having said that, we have one new actor on the scene that offers some promise to being able to galvanize and serve as a clearinghouse, and that is the North American Development Bank. And I won't presume to speak for Jeronimo, who will share his views with you himself in short order. But the fact of the matter is that NADBank, under his leadership, has begun to tackle the issue of infrastructure financing. And this is not only about capitalizing these projects yourself, but rather acting as a clearinghouse, becoming a center of information for communities engaging in the regional master planning process to be able to consult with an authoritative source that has reach into the financial community and can project with some certainty whether or not the project that is being considered actually has the capacity to be funded. It also has the potential role of being the lead bank, or at least a catalyst bank in terms of generating financing for projects. This is an incredibly important role to have a place in which borderlanders, business people, can repair to get authoritative information about how the market will react to a particular project. It is potentially a game changer. And coupled with the infrastructure that will permit Mexico and the United States, local authorities and federal authorities to actually plan together and then consult with the NADBank to peg financial prospects from the beginning, starts to provide this sequence of steps to fruition that has never existed before on the U.S.-Mexican border, which is why we find ourselves quite deficient in infrastructure. Robert Caro wrote a number of good books. But the one that I commend to you in this context is The Power Broker, which describes Robert Moses' effort to build New York City and much of New York State in terms of the infrastructure starting in the 1920s, and he lasted until the 1960s. I grew up in New York City, and he lasted long enough to drive the Brooklyn Dodgers to Los Angeles. So I've never forgiven him for that. But he is actually the person who designed, financed, bulldozed, and built most of what you see in New York City today in terms of roads and bridges. But the lesson of Robert Moses is that if you build it, they will come. And if you build new infrastructure, very quickly you see that you need more infrastructure. That's been the lesson. Aside from the Rio Bravo Donna Bridge, the second bridge opened up about a year ago was, not quite a year ago, was San Luis in Sonora in Arizona. Well, a year into the project, the wait times are exceedingly great. You build something and the traffic comes to it. That's been the lesson of every infrastructure project in a growing economic context, and we should expect to see it on the border regularly. So for that reason, I want to offer two potential ways forward in the future that we should think about. And none of this is this is where we need the Wilson Center, and we need the Legislative Conference to help develop these ideas. One of them is actually off the ground. It's the notion of public-private partnership in the context of border infrastructure. We have seen for a long time in Texas, Tamaulipas, Coahuila, Chihuahua, the phenomenon of the bridge over the Rio Grande, owned in some cases by the municipalities, in some cases by private companies. And that is something that has been long-standing, but has never really ever taken root in New Mexico, Chihuahua, Sonora, Arizona, or California, Baja California. And for the first time, we see a public-private partnership developing in the Tijuana, San Diego area, in which there has been a presidential permit, that record presidential permit, granted to a private group, binational, a Chicago group, but working together with a group in Baja California, that will build desires to build a bridge from San Diego, from Otay Mesa, over the highway, over the border fence, into Rodriguez Field, which is the Tijuana airport, and to basically charge a fee for parking and crossing, and using that toll to capitalize the project, and also, at least as DHS sees it, fund the operating expenses. Because public-private partnerships in which the private partners cannot actually develop business models that pay the freight are not much of a public-private partnership. And the last thing we want is a whole series of half-completed projects on our border. And the only way we can guard against that in the public-private context is to make sure the business model can more than pay for the operating costs and for the capital costs and the maintenance costs of these projects. But this notion is that instead of going through San Isidro, the largest land crossing in the world, or Otay Mesa, is you drive up to this new port, which is right on the U.S.-Mexico border. Rodriguez Field, the Tijuana airport, is right on the border. You build this, in effect, a pedestrian bridge right over. You have Mexican aduanas and immigration and NAME and CBP clearing immigration and customs, and you basically fly out. And since one of my before coming to Washington, I was chairing the San Diego Airport Authority. I know this very well. More than 1 million people actually use Tijuana Airport coming from Southern California, and that's projected to be 2 million people over the next 10 years. So this is a project that has wings, or at least legs, so to speak, and can work, but it's an important first development of a public-private partnership. Frankly, I think we need to see that all over the border. We will not be able to build enough infrastructure, if Moses is right here, as I believe he is, that we will never be able to get the public appropriations. That's not to say that we should leave it to the market alone. There will always be a place for the kind of binational construction of infrastructure. If NADBank can help finance some of it, all to the better. If, in fact, NADBank will help finance and serve as a clearinghouse for the legitimate market public-private partnerships, in fact, I think that we would start to see the development of infrastructure where it's needed, either because the regional master plans have determined that or the market will support it. So that's the unknown here, is how far we can enlist and engage the power of the market to build this infrastructure as we go forward. And now the last thought I want to leave you with, and perhaps the most unconventional, I guess would be the best term, which is that in some ways in the world we live in, the digital, instantaneous world we live in, we're operating in an anachronistic context of thinking of borders as lines, physical ports of entry, airports, seaports, land ports. But in the U.S.-Mexico context, we're thinking of we think about ports and borders as being lines on a map that separate juridically one country from the next. And while sovereignty always needs to be respected, in fact, the kind of cooperation that U.S. and Mexico are exhibiting now in the historic struggle against organized crime in Mexico make possible cooperation on the economic competitiveness front in a very important way that respects sovereignty but takes into account the fact that we limit ourselves if we think of the border as being the port of entry and needing a port of entry in order to facilitate the trade. If we limit ourselves to that 1,900 miles and to those 43 or 44 ports of entry that we depend on, even with the additional construction that we can project, we will never be able to handle the trade when it grows to 2 billion and then $2.5 billion a day, which is quite conceivable over the next generation. Borders are not just ports of entry, but increasingly should be viewed as flows of goods and people globally around the planet. And we at CBP increasingly see our job as getting information and doing work on immigration and on cargo as far back in terms of space geographically from the border and as early in time, as early before the person or the cargo arrives at the physical port of entry. We see securing flows as being central to the work, and the more of that work that we do away from the border and early in time, the better off we will be, because we can then focus the scarce inspectional resources at the physical port of entry on the cargo or the person about which we have adverse information or about which we lack sufficient information to be able to make a judgment about the reliability. So that what we want to do is have trusted shipper programs, authorized economic operator programs that permit us to do pre-clearance arrangements back as far away from the border and as early as possible. So I want you to engage with me in a vision of what this border ought to look like by 2025 at the latest. Automobile plant in Guanajuato. There should be a loading of that truck there in which either CBP officers are working with aduanas to watch the loading of the container, and then that truck is then sealed. Images of or if there are no CBP officers there, you have a Mexican aduanas or retired Mexican aduanas using X-ray machines, doing X-ray machines, and the images being transported to Virginia for analysis, for clearance. Then a seal is placed on the truck. A geospatial mechanism and transponder is placed on the truck, and the truck is monitored as it comes up toward the U.S. border. It comes into Laredo and does not stop at the physical port of entry, but rather continues on because it has been monitored the whole way and pre-cleared in Guanajuato. Trust me, we will have enough traffic at Laredo port of entry. But the fact is that if we can segment traffic based on risk and permit the trusted traffic to move through our ports of entry and around our ports of entry based on reliable pre-clearance, it will add an additional capacity to the U.S.-Mexican border that otherwise will not exist, notwithstanding whatever investments we make in the public sector or, in fact, in the public-private sector. And this combination of borders as infrastructure that is modern, that permits the passage, is one important development, coupled with the notion of pre-clearance. And I do not think it is far-fetched any longer to think that we will be in a position someday to see a truck loaded in Guadalajara and ending up in Toronto. And while it will have been secured and inspected, it will not stop, not at the U.S.-Mexican border nor at the U.S.-Canadian border. El futuro ya no es lo que era antes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, we can add el futuro no es lo que hay ahorita tampoco, right? It could be even greater. Commissioner, that was fabulous. And if you could take a couple questions here. Do we have any questions here? Let me recognize Diana Negroponte, one of our advisory board members. Lázaro Cárdenas is back there as well. Just very distinguished audience here. Russ, let me recognize everyone here. Much of the first three rows you see here are state legislators from Mexico and the United States. For the Border Legislative Conference, I'm very honored to have all of you here, elected representatives from the 10 border states. State Representative Russ Jones.
Thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner. You were describing to some degree, the secure border project that is being a demonstration project in El Paso.
Sorry, if we could get you to use the if we get you to use the mic because of translation, and we also have some people joining us via video conference, by the way. And hello to everyone out in cyberspace.
You're going to need to get roller skates for your microphone person to catch up with us.
Yeah, we will, exactly. From the state of Arizona, actually.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. My question, you were describing in your comments the secure border project, that's a demonstration project in El Paso, and my question was, can you give us an update on the status of that project?
Actually, Ben Rawbaugh from the Commissioner's office is here, and he is the Del Paso Norte liaison directly with the project. But let me describe, before I ask Ben to help us with the exact up-to-the-date current status, what this is a project that basically takes some of the elements of what I've spoke about. It's a maquila in Juarez. The truck is loaded. There's actually a video that can be transmitted ahead that shows what's going on to the truck. X-ray images can be transmitted. Truck is then sealed and then crosses into El Paso on a hopefully on one of the fast lanes over the Bridge of the Americas, Bota, and then actually is then deemed inspected without having to stop either at presumably either at aduanas on an outbound or inbound. The issue there was always how to generate enough of the Maquila Association to participate, to be able to generate the revenue that would make Senor Holguin's project. He's developed the tracking mechanism, which is quite creative, not rocket science, but quite applied, and to do it in a commercially feasible way. I'll ask Mr. Rawbaugh to provide the current status, and then if it is what it is, I'll offer a further unsolicited comment.
There we go. Ben, if you could, yes.
Hello, everybody. Just very, very quickly, there's sort of two big things we're working through right now, and the first is just the way that we're going to have our processes work at the port, and the second thing is the project sponsors are working through the industry commitments and figuring out, which plants would be involved and when they would be able to send the trucks. And so as soon as we've got a schedule together on that, we should be able to move pretty quickly to get the timing for the initial participants ready.
Okay, so they're working through the details, but I will offer you my unsolicited comment. And since you're a legislator, you'll appreciate the reference. The problem with todos somos fronterizos, we're all borderlanders. The problem is that a long time ago we developed a bad habit. We waited for Mexico, the Mexican government, the U.S. government to give us a handout. We were always waiting around for the grant or the federal money that would come, and nothing happened because the money never came. These public-private partnerships, of which you talk about one, has got to be self-sustaining. This is not about government money. The part of the public-private partnership is we actually make sure that the regulatory system facilitates and expedites the lawful traffic. That's the obligation of the government. But in fact, the private proposition, the business proposition, needs to rest on its 4 feet. And I say that with some passion because in the Rodriguez Field deal, the first thing that the group said was, well, how do we know you're going to give us enough border officers, CBPOs? I hear that all over. We have 327 airports, seaports. Everybody thinks they're understaffed, and we are, but for reasons that are not. We don't have the time to go into here. But the fact is, as I say to the people at Rodriguez Field, so I say to the people in El Paso Juarez, come up with a business model. it is worth your while to get by to knock the transaction costs down by 25%. You could pay the $20 or the $50 or the $75 that it would take to get that truck across the border uninspected. And as long as we wait for the Department of Transportation or DHS or someone else to come up with a grant to pay for it, we will wait. So I would say to the business people, the entrepreneurs who need to make these projects work, take out your sharp pencil and figure out at which point the fee that you pay goes better to propel the project so that you'll generate a larger bottom line than if you wait for the government to come up with that grant, which always comes in 3 years late and half as much as you thought you were getting.
Let's take another question or comment. I think, Diana.
You can put me down as undecided on that.
Commissioner Burson, thank you very much for the frankness of your answer. Diana Negroponte from the Brookings Institution. How do you cope with the backlog of trucks 10 miles away from the border? Does the construction of new roads become part of the PPP?
Absolutely. Negroponte, that's part of the lack of the planning. I think the fact that we now have the potential for a genuine planning process means that we will be able to start to plan roads as well as infrastructure. It's an enormous problem. So we're investing $600 million in San Isidro. The project was initiated, as I said, last week. We're going to increase the lanes from 24 to, I believe, to which? 42? To 42. And they're going to be double stacking. But here's the problem. And then Mexico is investing $150 million or more in the Chaparral and other projects. Here's the problem. The roads in Tijuana, they're 4 lanes. 4 lanes come in, and that's, even on the US 5 freeway going south or 805 freeways going south, there may be 8 lanes, which still can't serve that port. The bottlenecks are enormous. So the friendly amendment to all of this that's where the public-private partnerships come in. It was an enormously creative idea that was done with regard to the construction of the Otay East, the new port of entry in Otay. California did something that was quite extraordinary. The California legislature permitted the building of a toll road, and for the first time that I'm aware of, a state legislature actually provided that the proceeds of the toll road could be used to build a federal port of entry. So what you will have right from the beginning is a toll road that is aligned with the port of entry, and we will be able to avoid the the kinds of bottlenecks that we have. But road building is absolutely critical, such that I think when we really get rolling, so to speak, on these projects, we're going to have to build a whole new series of toll roads to make it work. Because otherwise we will constantly, will have pushed the bottleneck a little further down or up the road. But yes, but think about the potential that we now can plan these together so that Mexican architects and designers, U.S. designers and architects can actually sit down together, city planners, and part of the regional master plans actually takes that into account.
We could, I know, go on for quite a while here, but in the interest of time, we have a very packed agenda. Thank you very much, Commissioner Burson, for coming, and a round of applause. Please don't get up and go, because we're going straight into our next session here. Yes. Thank you, Alan. We are extremely pleased as we move into our next session here to have Jerónimo Gutierrez, I am not going to introduce him. My colleague Ramiro Flores, who is the chair of the Border Legislative Conference, is going to introduce him. But before I let Congressman Ramiro Flores do that, let me just say that Jerónimo has been a great friend of the Woodrow Wilson Center. I was remembering back as I saw you sitting here maybe 7 or 8 years ago, one of the first events, if not the first one we ever did in the auditorium as the Mexico Institute was Jerónimo Gutierrez as Undersecretary for North American Affairs of Foreign Relations. So we're very happy to have him here. I believe his first public address in Washington as Managing Director of the North American Development Bank, and very pleased to have him back in Washington, and Congressman Flores.
Muy buenas tardes. En primer lugar, agradecemos a todos los amigos visitantes que están interesados en estos temas que a los legisladores de la franja fronteriza del sur de Estados Unidos y el norte de México hoy nos reúne en este importante centro. Las tareas que hemos emprendido durante todo este día han sido temas sumamente interesantes que indudablemente elevan la calidad de vida de nuestros habitantes de esa importante franja fronteriza. Decirles que la influencia del Banco de Desarrollo de América del Norte son físicamente, su inversión se realiza en 100 kilómetros hacia Estados Unidos, hacia el norte, y 300 kilómetros hacia el sur en México. Este banco es una institución financiera bilateral administrada y capitalizada en partes iguales tanto por Estados Unidos como por México, con el único propósito de financiar proyectos ambientales certificados por la Comisión de Cooperación Ecológica Fronteriza. Las instituciones trabajan juntos con una comunidad y promotores de proyectos en ambos países para fomentar y financiar la infraestructura necesaria y así lograr un medio ambiente limpio y sano para todos los habitantes de nuestra frontera. En noviembre pasado, la Junta Directiva del Banco nombró a Jerónimo Gutierrez como su nuevo director general. Jerónimo tiene una amplia experiencia en las relaciones México-Estados Unidos y en asuntos fronterizos, habiendo servido como subsecretario para América del Norte en la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores de México del año 2003 al 2006. Además, fue subsecretario para América Latina y el Caribe y más recientemente se desempeñó como subsecretario de Gobierno en la Secretaría del Gobierno. En el área de finanzas fue el jefe del Consejo Asesor de Personal del Ministerio de Hacienda y Crédito Público y asesor para el Banco de Desarrollo Mexicano de Obras y Servicios Públicos, conocido con nosotros como Banobras. El señor Gutiérrez recibió su licenciatura en Economía por el Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México en la Ciudad de México y tiene una maestría en Administración Pública de la John F. Kennedy en la Escuela de Gobierno en la Universidad de Harvard. Me permito presentarlo con mucho orgullo para que exponga su tema.
Muchas gracias, diputado Flores, presidente del Border Legislative Conference. Andrew, thanks for having us here. It's really a pleasure for me, both personally and professionally, to be here again at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm humbled to see many familiar faces and some friends here. I'm humbled also to have so many Mexican legislatures here present. Señoras y señores diputados, qué bueno que están aquí. Es un honor dirigirme a ustedes también. And I'm glad to see familiar faces, including that of Lázaro Cárdenas, a young former governor of Michoacán who's currently a scholar here. Qué gusto que estén aquí todos y a nuestros amigos de la prensa. It's really important for the North American Development Bank to be here today. Why is that? Because, in essence, we believe that we can be a much more useful tool in creating this 21st century border between Mexico and the United States. I celebrate personally and institutionally that this event is taking place, as I mentioned earlier today, because there is a 21st century border means different things for different people. And I think that exercises as the one we are having today and some other that have been sponsored by the center are extremely helpful in bringing together opinions and constructing that much needed shared vision about what the border between Mexico and the United States should be in the 21st century. So I'm really glad that this event is taking place. I also mentioned earlier today that if I had to summarize what the 21st century border implies, I think it's three things. It's certainly security, an issue that has been fully discussed in different forums. It's also, as Commissioner Bersin was saying, it's about competitiveness. And it's also, and very importantly, about sustainability and environmental sustainability. During today's conference, I'm sure that you will be touching, the other speakers on these 3 points and these 3 objectives. And again, my presence here is with one central message: is both governments are poised to take far more advantage of the North American Development Bank and the Border Environmental Cooperation Commission in the present context. And I will try to explain why. And before I delve back to this topic of competitiveness, sustainability, and security, let me just very briefly tell you where the bank is right now and what has happened over its last 16 years of operation. First of all, we're not that known among scholars, opinion leaders, public officials, and in general, in movers and shakers, both in Mexico and the United States, the bank and the Commission are not that well known, and we hope to change that. Why is that? Because the bank was created, along with the Commission, 16 years ago, largely as a byproduct of NAFTA. At that time, there were very legitimate and very serious concerns about what the North American Free Trade Agreement would imply in terms of the environment, and specifically at the border. So it was very visionary that these two institutions, the bank and the Commission, were created with one single purpose, which is to protect, preserve, and enhance the environment in the border region through environmental infrastructure. What has happened very briefly over these 16 years? The first thing is that it's been extremely difficult creating a binational public development bank that handles environmental issues. Why is that? Because environmental infrastructure projects are difficult to develop, and they're even more difficult to finance and make bankable. And that has certainly been the case. As there is currently an international thrust to create the so-called green banks, Great Britain is, I think, putting one together with $6 billion pounds, and India is doing pretty much the same thing. Well, it just so happens that the North American Development Bank has acquired a unique experience in facing precisely the same type of challenges that these new institutions are facing, because we've been there for more than a decade trying to figure out how to finance environmental infrastructure in a way that improves the environment. The second thing is, in that regard, we have experienced a learning curve, but we are certainly I think we have developed a unique expertise in terms of what the challenges at the border are, especially in terms of infrastructure and especially in terms of environmental infrastructure. It took almost 10 years, more than 10 years actually, more than a decade, to have the bank actually lend more than it's paid in capital. Usually a bank will lend several times its capital, even to 8 times its capital. Well, in our case, we went through 2 phases, which one I call the what do we do next phase. After these institutions were created, I guess everybody had to sit down and figure out what would they actually be doing, and that took us about in the neighborhood of 5 to 6 years. Then a consolidating phase, meaning actually operating as a lending bank and creating and financing infrastructure. And I hope that we're now in a growing phase. But having said that, I think that after 16 years, the bank is, along with the Commission, have never been better in terms of fulfilling its mission, their mission. We are currently involved in 150 projects throughout the border. We have financed $1.2 billion in these projects, roughly half of them in non-reimbursable resources, essentially from the EPA, through EPA grants, and the rest in formal lending operations to both local and local public entities and private firms in both sides of the border. More importantly, these resources have leveraged about, for every dollar that we have financed, about $2 more have come into the border region, because they are the total cost of these projects is roughly around $3.2 billion. And at the same time, the bank, I think, to its credit, has consolidated as a financial institution. We've gone out for the first time in the open markets to raise money for building infrastructure at the border. We have gotten, just last year, very good credit ratings internationally. And that, in some, we're now a bank. We're now up, after 15 years, we're now operating formally as a public development bank. And I think that is extremely good news for the border, and extremely good news at a time that both governments are committing in building the so-called 21st century border between Mexico and the United States. And why is that? Essentially for three reasons. The first one is the environment. The border region has grown, both in the United States and Mexico, has grown both in terms of population and economically much more faster than the rest of the countries in Mexico and the United States. That is very good news, certainly, but it also represents an important challenge for the environment. The border is what, and I hope to get the term right, but the border region currently experience, and it will continue to experience, a lot of environmental stress, and especially water stress, for example, and air quality stress. And therefore, if we want to have a 21st century border, we need to make sure that we are taking care appropriately of the environmental impacts of things, and that we're doing projects that will preserve, protect, and enhance the environment. Secondly, there is a great need, as it has been said, for border infrastructure in general. Commissioner Bursin was saying that there are in the neighborhood of $6 billion worth of needs in border infrastructure. The North American Center for Transboundary Studies just recently published a report called North America Next, a report to President Obama, in which they place that figure at $16 billion only at the border. And if you look at the needs of infrastructure throughout North America, including trade corridors, the figure might go, I think, to $250 billion, if I'm not mistaken. So that just gives you a sense of the important need of building that infrastructure. The bank can play an important role, especially on the ports of entry system. First of all, there is no other institution that has acquired such a knowledge about what does the border need, if not for any other reason, that we've been there for the past 16 years. Secondly, we are working with private sector and public sector in building these partnerships that are needed to get going a lot more border infrastructure. And thirdly, we do it in a way, because that is our mandate, that it helps have a positive impact on the environment. Let me tell you a story. We just financed for the first time a border crossing. In 16 years, this is the first time that the bank actually financed the San Luis Rio Colorado Yuma crossing. And why I think it's a good example, because I think it shows why the bank can and should be, along with the Commission, more involved as a catalyst of this type of infrastructure projects. The first thing is that the crossing was going to build was going to be built sooner or later because it's needed. And there is a great need, a great demand of the part of the both communities to have that specific infrastructure. The second thing is that that particular crossing has a positive environmental impact because of the reduction in the waiting times. And my EPA colleagues know that we need to prove that scientifically, and we do always our best attempt. But the second thing is that we connected a electricity facility by which the trucks, rather than waiting, because a lot of trucks with vegetables are going through, rather than waiting, and they're refrigerated, so rather than waiting with their engines open, they can now connect and therefore not have the engines running while they're waiting. So that it's a good example about how we can green, and that's where we want to go in the future, not only working in the traditional sectors as water and wastewater treatment plants, as paving, but take advantage of the bank in a way that it can be an incentive for all infrastructure at the border to be greener. From our point of view, it makes sense because the infrastructure is going to be built sooner or later. There is certainly a need to be each day more environmentally conscious and more energy efficient in many ways. And if that is going to happen, we have an institution that will probably help do precisely that and move the infrastructure towards, with a more environmental view. The second reason why we believe we can play a larger role is that when we talk about security at the border, when there's talk about the Merida Initiative, actually pillars 3 and 4 of the Merida Initiative, which is the basic binational strategy to addressing organized crime, talk about things that we have been involved throughout the past 16 years. One of them is building strong and resilient communities along the border. And we're working, it is extremely important. There's a huge difference in a community once you got water, running water, and the water being treated, and paving, and other type of community service. We're doing that. So in a sense, we're supporting that third pillar. And the other one is precisely building a 21st century border. And finally, the third reason why I believe that we are, again, very eager and very capable of playing a larger role is that the relation is currently, as it has been said throughout the day, it's always complex. The security issues right now at the border tend to take precedence, both in terms of public opinion and what actually the governments are doing vis-a-vis other types, other issues at the border. But the bank can serve, along with the Commission, as a very positive element. It has always been the case in the relation. There are absolutely, both institutions have a binational character. We have U.S. and Mexican nationals working side by side to improve things at the border. And it can always be relied upon by the governments to be a positive element of the overall bilateral relation. We just presented our board in this past month of February. We just presented some basic principles about what we're going to do for the next 5 years. And I will mention very briefly, and I hope that at some point in time we will send the information here to the center, because we want to move forward in the next 5 years in 3 or 4 directions. The first one is we need to get more projects going. If we're not delivering, meaning producing and also financing more projects at the border, then we're not accomplishing our mission. In the end, yes, we can do the technical assistance. Yes, we can be part of the policy process. We can be participating in conference. But in the end, it's how many projects that are successfully built and operated the way we can measure our results. The second thing is we want to work, and without losing track of the core objective of protecting, preserving, and enhancing their environment, we want to participate in other infrastructure projects to the extent that we can prove to our board that our participation implies that, that we're greening the project, that we are making a significant difference in terms of the environment, regardless of the nature of the project. The third thing is that we are going to have to do some more marketing, because in the end, we operate with private firms, we operate with local authorities, but we need to have we need to be more known in order to have people be interested in having the bank finance projects. And finally, there's we need to be much more efficient in the process by which we authorize the projects, which is a relatively complex process, because it naturally, since it involves tax resources both from the United States and Mexico, it is very important that we follow very specific procedures. If we're able to accomplish that, and I will close with this, we believe that we can take our balance from the $550 million that we presently have in a fairly, in a 3, maybe 4 years, to the $3 billion that the bank actually has as capital. And if we get to a point, then we can be worried about what doing next. And we're not asking for any more resources out of either the U.S. government or the Mexican government. We're just essentially asking, give us a vote of confidence that our institutions are at a crossroads right now, and that we can either continue to play a decent but very marginal role in terms of protecting, preserving, and enhancing the environment and improving the living standards of communities in the border, or we can have a more significant role in that regard, and that is precisely what we want to do. So I hope that as you know, I now need to sell. I used to talk only about security, but now I need to do a bit of selling about the banking. So if anybody's interested in projects at the border, we'll be outside the door for you. Thank you.
With the checkbook? Are you willing? We're running a little short on time, but we'd like to actually see if we can take a couple questions,
sure,
if you're willing to do that. Are there a couple questions from the audience or comments? Right here, diputada. And then we'll go.
Hay temas que me quedan muy claro por aquello de la ecología. Sé que el banco apoya proyectos en algunos lados de la frontera, concretamente en Laredo. Pero retomando un poquito el problema que tenemos ahí, que es la deportación tan alta de personas, que nos hace que se engrosen los cinturones de miseria y haya lo que se llama paracaidismo, invasión de tierras ilegalmente. Una necesidad muy grande que vemos en la frontera es la de generar reservas territoriales. Mi pregunta iría encaminada a que si el banco es factible que a préstamos de fondo perdido se pueda desarrollar un proyecto de reserva territorial con la construcción de casas ecológicas, por ejemplo, y qué otros proyectos pudieran generarse a fondo perdido así.
Not everyone has a headset on, so for everyone's translation, the quick question is, within Nuevo Laredo, there's a lot of deportations leading to a rise in need for housing and land invasions, and can the Ned Bank be used out of their funds to support, for example, ecological housing? And Eric, I believe you had your hand up as well. We'll take two questions and we'll come back to the General Director of the Ned Bank.
Hi, Mr. Gutierrez. Eric Lee from the North American Center for Transporter Studies at ASU. Thanks for the plug for our report to President Obama from 2009. Very briefly, the NADBank's work on San Luis II, I think, was a breakthrough. I didn't quite make the connection between Commissioner Burson's comments about the importance of NADBank to the development of our ports of entry. and your comments on NADBank's activities. Could you expand a little bit and give us some hope that ports of entry and NADBank will kind of come together fortuitously for North America?
Certainly. Diputada, let me first answer your question. I think there's two parts to your question. The first one is about housing. Let me talk a bit about green housing. The Border Environmental Cooperation Commission came out recently with a study that includes in the neighborhood of 76 indicators that if comply with would imply that you have a greenhouse and it's energy efficient. 26 of them don't imply a cost for the construction. 25 of them will raise the cost of the house around 10%, and the latest 25 would raise the cost of the house to around 25%. So we're working with the Commission and some developers and authorities in Mexico at this point to see whether we can finance for the first time green housing at the border, which will be extremely important, regardless of whether it's located in a special land reservoir or not. We hope that within this year we can be involved for the first time in green housing, which happens to have, I think, a very positive, not only the environmental impact, but also it can help in terms of the migration flows. It will help certainly build employment on the Mexican side. And I think that it will also be useful as part of the immigration debate, because you're going to have people that are going to be living in much more dignified conditions on the Mexican side. So that's one thing we are working, and will be willing to work with Tamaulipas, as we are now doing with the state of Baja California, specifically on housing. And the second thing is reserves, land reserves. We are not a regulatory agency, so we really don't have any. Our capacity to be involved in creating land reserves at the border is limited. I think that is needed. Well, first of all, yeah, we're not really involved in those land reserves, and non-reimbursable recourses are at this point very scarce. We do have some available at the bank, but each day they're more and more scarce, because both the U.S. and the Mexican government are at a very difficult fiscal position at that time. So we are going with our clients and essentially telling them, don't count too much on non-reimbursable resources, because they're not going to be longer available throughout essentially the next 10 years, either from the Mexican side or from the U.S. side. And that means that our lending operations take precedence. And nevertheless, we provide the best conditions to finance projects, including the one you mentioned. And again, if we can do a pitch for you, we're more than happy. Regarding the issue of the question raised by our colleague from the center, there is the story about border crossings has improved a lot, as it was said. When I was in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it was really a horror story what was going on, to be honest, because we had a story about a bridge going nowhere from the United States to Mexico, and on the Mexican side there was nothing. We had, we were building very modern infrastructure, but at the same time there was El Chalán, which I think it still exists, which is pulled by a rope, and it's a formal crossing. We were taking 8 years to get a presidential permit and a permit to actually, begin building. So that has improved a lot, as the Commissioner was saying, and I'm glad now. What do we want to do is we want to be involved in financing specifically the border crossings that there are several projects planned at the planning stages, to the extent that our involvement can prove that there is a significant improvement, protection, preserve, or enhance the environment. The major issue or the major clue there is air quality. If you have 2,000 cars, as you do in San Isidro or more, with their engines running for 2 hours, well, that does represent an important emission problem. And we hope that, as we are doing now, if you expedite those flows, there is a significant reduction in emissions, and that is what we work with our colleagues at EPA to prove. But in general, again, it's changing a bit the paradigm and saying, allow us to be involved and either finance the green component of a project, or let us prove that our involvement will make the project much more environmentally conscious, and let us look at it on a case-by-case basis. We do need to make the case to our board that there is a clear environmental due diligence process. But I believe that if we're creative, 3 years ago we didn't have any paving projects, and now paving on the U.S. side and on the Mexican side has become an important part of our operations, because there's an issue on air quality, and there's also an issue of when you do the paving, you do part of the water infrastructure. Commissioner Bursin talked about being a catalyst, the point being that we are very, very few institutions, I think, have the expertise to work with the private and public sponsors of any border crossing in a way that pools resources either from governments, private sponsors through a concession, make the financial structure necessary to make the project viable. And I think that is at least what I have talked previously with Commissioner Bursin. And I think we have a good chance out of the different, there are 20 projects that are on the planning stages. And if we can be part of the financing, we will certainly like to. That's pretty much where we are at this point.
Thank you. I know there's a great deal more questions from our friend Carlos de la Parra from COLEF here. But in the interest of time, we have a fabulous panel coming up next. We are not going to take a break, but feel free to stand and stretch. And then we'll have a great closing as well. And we want to thank Jerónimo Gutierrez, Director General of the NAD Bank, for a fabulous presentation. We look forward to having him back frequently.